The Nature of Mind by David M. Armstrong. It is from The Nature of Mind and Other Essays, published in 1981. David M. Armstrong, from 1926 to 2014, was Challis Professor of Philosophy at the University of Sydney, Australia. His publications included Perception and the Physical World, A Materialist Theory of the Mind, and Universals and Scientific Realism. Men have minds, that is to say, they perceive, they have sensations, emotions, beliefs, thoughts, purposes, and desires. What is it to have a mind? What is it to perceive, to feel emotion, to hold a belief, or to have a purpose? In common with many other modern philosophers, I think that the best clue we have to the nature of mind is furnished by the discoveries and hypotheses of modern science concerning the nature of humans. What does modern science have to say about the nature of humans? There are, of course, all sorts of disagreements and divergencies in the views of individual scientists. But I think it is true to say that one view is steadily gaining ground, so that it bids fair to become established scientific doctrine. This is the view that we can give a complete account of humankind in purely physico-chemical terms. This view has received a tremendous impetus in the last decade from the new subject of molecular biology, a subject which promises to unravel the physical and chemical mechanisms which lie at the basis of life. Before that time, it received great encouragement from pioneering work in neurophysiology, pointing to the likelihood of a purely electrochemical account of the working of the brain. I think it is fair to say that those scientists who still rejected the physico-chemical account of humankind do so primarily for philosophical or moral or religious reasons, and only secondarily and half-heartedly for reasons of scientific detail. This is not to say that in the future new evidence and new problems may not come to light, which will force science to reconsider the physico-chemical view of man. But at present, the drift of scientific thought is clearly set towards the physico-chemical hypothesis, and we have nothing better to go on than the present. For me, then, and for many philosophers who think like me, the moral is clear. We must try to work out an account of the nature of mind which is compatible with the view that man is nothing but a physico-chemical mechanism. And I shall be concerned to do just this, to sketch in barest outline what may be called a materialist or physicalist account of the mind. But before doing this, I should like to go back and consider a criticism of my position, which I must inevitably occur to some. What reason have I, it may be asked, for asking my stand on science? Even granting that I am right about what is the currently dominant scientific view of man, why should we concede science a special authority to decide questions about the nature of man? What of the authority of philosophy, of religion, of morality, or even the literature of art? Why do I set the authority of science above all these? Why this scientism? It seems to me that the answer to this question is very simple. If we consider the search for truth in all its fields, we find that it is only in science that men versed in their subject can, after investigation, that is, more or less prolonged, and which may in some cases extend beyond a single human lifetime, reach substantial agreement about what is the case. It is only as a result of scientific investigation that we ever seem to reach an intellectual consensus about controversial matters. In the epistle dedicatory to his De Compore, Hobbes wrote of William Harvey, the discoverer of the circulation of the blood, that he was the only man I know that, conquering envy, has established a new doctrine in his lifetime. Before Copernicus, Galileo, and Harvey, Hobbes remarks, quote, "There was nothing certain in natural philosophy." And we might add, with the exception of mathematics, there was nothing certain in any other learned discipline. These remarks of Hobbes are incredibly revealing. They show to us what a watershed in the intellectual history of the human race the 17th century was. Before that time, inquiry proceeded, as it were, in the dark. Men could not hope to see their doctrine established, that is to say, accepted by the vast majority of those properly versed in the subject under discussion. There was no intellectual consensus. Since that time, it has become a commonplace to see new doctrines, sometimes of the most far-reaching kind, established to the satisfaction of the learned, often within the lifetime of their first proponents. Science, or what was formerly called natural philosophy, has provided us with a method of deciding disputed questions. This is not to say, of course, that the consensus of those who are learned and competent in a subject cannot be mistaken. Of course, such a consensus can be mistaken. Sometimes it has been mistaken. But granting fallibility, what better authority have we than such a consensus? Now, this is of utmost importance, for in philosophy, in religion, in such disciplines as literary criticism, in moral questions insofar as they are thought to be matters of truth and falsity, there has been a notable failure to achieve an intellectual consensus about disputed questions among the learned. Must we not then attach a peculiar authority to the discipline that can achieve a consensus? And if it presents us with a certain vision of the nature of man, is this not a powerful reason for accepting that vision? I will not take up here the deeper question why it is that the methods of science have enabled us to achieve an intellectual consensus about so many disputed matters. That question, I think, could receive no brief or uncontroversial answer. I am resting my argument on the simple and uncontroversial fact that as a result of scientific investigation, such a consensus has been achieved. It may be replied, it often is replied, that while science is all very well in its own sphere, the sphere of the physical, perhaps, there are matters of fact on which it is not competent to pronounce. And among such matters, it may be claimed, is the question, what is the whole nature of man? But I cannot see that this reply has much force. Science has provided us with an island of truths, or perhaps one should say a raft of truths, to bear us up on the sea of our disputatious ignorance. There may have to be revisions and refinements. New results may set old findings in a new perspective, but what science has given us will not be altogether superseded. Must we not therefore appeal to these relative certainties for guidance when we come to consider uncertainties elsewhere? Perhaps science cannot help us to decide whether or not there is a God, whether or not human beings have immortal souls, or whether or not the will is free. But if science cannot assist us, what can? I conclude that it is the scientific vision of man, and not the philosophical or religious or artistic or moral vision of man, that is the best clue we have to the nature of man. And it is rational to argue from the best evidence that we have. Having in this way attempted to justify my procedure, I turn back to my subject. The attempt to work out an account of mind, or, if you prefer, of mental process, within the framework of the physico-chemical, or, as we may call it, the materialist view of man. Now, there is one account of mental process that is at once attractive to any philosopher sympathetic to a materialist view of man. This is behaviorism. Formulated originally by a psychologist named John B. Watson, it attracted widespread interest and considerable support from scientifically oriented philosophers in the Americas. Traditional philosophy had tended to think of the mind as a rather mysterious inward arena that lay behind and was responsible for the outward or physical behavior of our bodies. Descartes thought of this inner arena as a spiritual substance, and it was this conception of the mind as spiritual object that Gilbert Ryle at Oxford attacked, apparently in the interest of behaviorism, in his important book, The Concept of Mind. He ridiculed the Cartesian view as the dogma of the ghost in the machine. The mind was not something behind the behavior of the body. It was simply part of that physical behavior. My anger with you is not some modification of a spiritual substance which somehow brings about aggressive behavior. Rather, it is the aggressive behavior itself. My addressing strong words to you, striking you, turning my back on you, and so on. Thought is not an inner process that lies behind and brings about the words I speak and write. It is my speaking and writing. The mind is not an inner arena. It is outward act. It is clear that such a view of mind fits in very well with a completely materialistic or physicalist view of man. If there is no need to draw a distinction between mental processes and their expression in physical behavior, but if instead the mental processes are identified with their so-called expressions, then the existence of mind stands in no conflict with the view that man is nothing but a physico-chemical mechanism. However, the version of behaviorism that I have just sketched is a very crude version, and its crudity lays it open to obvious objections. One obvious difficulty is that it is our common experience that there can be mental processes going on, although there is no behavior occurring that could possibly be treated as expressions of these processes. A man may be angry, but give no bodily sign. He may think, but say or do nothing at all. In my view, the most plausible attempt to refine behaviorism with a view to meeting this objection was made by introducing the notion of a disposition to behave. Dispositions to behave play a particularly important part in Ryle's account of mind. Let us consider the general notion of disposition first. Brittleness is a disposition possessed by materials like glass. Brittle materials are those which, when subjected to relatively small forces, break or shatter easily. But breaking and shattering easily is not brittleness. Rather, it is the manifestation of brittleness. Brittleness itself is the tendency or liability of the material to break or shatter easily. A piece of glass may never shatter or break throughout its whole history, but it is still the case that it is brittle. It is liable to shatter or break if dropped quite a small way or hit quite lightly. And obviously, that points to its fragility. Now, a disposition to behave is simply a tendency or liability of a person to behave in a certain way under certain circumstances. The brittleness of glass is a disposition that the glass retains throughout its history, but clearly there could also be dispositions that come and go. The dispositions to behave that are of interest to the behaviorist are, for the most part, of this temporary character. Now, how did Ryle and others use this notion of a disposition to behave in order to meet the obvious objection to behaviorism that there can be mental processes going on, although the subject is engaging in no relevant behavior? Their strategy was to argue that in such cases, although the subject was not behaving in any way relevant, he or she was disposed to behave in some relevant way. The glass does not shatter, but it is still brittle. The man does not behave, but he does have a disposition to behave. We can say he thinks although he does not speak or act because at that time he was disposed to speak or act in a certain way. If he had been asked, or perhaps he would have spoken or acted. We can say he is angry although he does not behave angrily because he is disposed so to behave. If only one more word had been addressed to him, he would have burst out, and so on. In this way, it was hoped that behaviorism could be squared with the obvious facts. It is very important to see just how these thinkers conceived of disposition. I quote from Ryle. Quote, "To possess a dispositional property is not to be in a particular state or to undergo a particular change. It is to be bound or liable to be in a particular state or to undergo a particular change when a particular condition is realized." End quote. And that is from The Concept of Mind, page 43. So, to explain the breaking of a lightly struck glass on a particular occasion by saying that it was brittle is, on this view of dispositions, simply to say that the glass broke because it is the sort of thing that regularly breaks when quietly struck. Lightly, the breaking was the normal behavior or not abnormal behavior of such a thing. The brittleness is not to be conceived of as a cause for the breakage, or even more vaguely, a factor in bringing about the breaking. Brittleness is just the fact that things of that sort break easily. But although in this way the behaviorist did something to deal with the objection that mental processes can occur in the absence of behavior, it seems clear now that the shouting and the dust have died, that they did not do enough. When I think, but my thoughts do not issue in any action, it seems as obvious as anything is obvious that there is something actually going on in me which constitutes my thought. It is not simply that I would speak or act if some condition or conditions that are unfulfilled were to be fulfilled. Something is currently going on in the strongest and most literal sense of going on, and this something is my thought. Rylean behaviorism denies this, and so it is unsatisfactory as a theory of mind. Yet I know of no version of behaviorism that is more satisfactory. the moral of those of us who wish to make and take a purely physicalistic view of man is that we must look for some other account of the nature of mind and of mental processes. But perhaps we need not grieve too deeply about the failure of behaviorism to produce a satisfactory theory of mind. Behaviorism is a profoundly unnatural account of mental processes. If somebody speaks and acts in certain ways, it is natural to speak of this speech and action as the expression of his or her thought. It is not at all natural to speak of his or her speech and action as identical with his or her thought. We naturally think of the thought as something quite distinct from the speech and action which, under suitable circumstances, brings the speech and action about. Thoughts are not to be identified with behavior. We think they lie behind behavior. A man's behavior constitutes the reason we have for attributing certain mental processes to him, but the behavior cannot be identified with the mental processes. This suggests a very interesting line of thought about the mind. Behaviorism is certainly wrong, but perhaps it is not altogether wrong. Perhaps the behaviorists are wrong in identifying the mind and mental occurrences with behavior, but perhaps they are right in thinking that our notion of a mind and of individual mental states is logically tied to behavior. For perhaps that what we mean by a mental state is some state of the person which, under suitable circumstances, brings about a certain range of behavior. Perhaps mind can be defined not as behavior, but rather as the inner cause of certain behavior. Thought is not speech under suitable circumstances, rather it is something within the person which, in suitable circumstances, brings about speech. And in fact, I believe that this is the true account, or at any rate, a true first account of what we mean by a mental state. How does this line of thought link up with a purely physicalist view of man? The position is, I think, that while it does not make such a physicalist view inevitable, it does make it possible. It does not entail, but it is compatible with, a purely physicalist view of man. For if our notion of the mind and mental states is nothing but that of a cause within the person of certain ranges of behavior, then it becomes a scientific question, and not a question of logical analysis, what in fact the intrinsic nature of that cause is. The cause might be, as Descartes thought it was, a spiritual substance working through the pineal gland to produce the complex bodily behavior of which men are capable. It might be breath or especially smooth and mobile atoms dispersed throughout the body. It might be many other things. But in fact, the verdict of modern science seems to be that the sole cause of mind betokening behavior in man and the higher animals is the physico-chemical workings of the central nervous system, or the CNS. And so, assuming that we have correctly characterized our concept of a mental state as nothing but the cause of certain sorts of behavior, then we can identify these mental states with purely physical states of the central nervous system. At this point, we may stop and go back to the behaviorist dispositions. We saw that according to them, the brittleness of glass, or to take another example, the elasticity of rubber, is not a state of the glass or the rubber, but is simply the fact that things of that sort behave in the way they do. But now let us consider how a scientist would think about brittleness or elasticity. Faced with the phenomenon of breaking under relatively small impacts, or the phenomenon of stretching when a force is applied, followed by a contradiction when the force is removed, he will assume that there is some current state of the glass or the rubber which is responsible for the characteristic behavior of samples of these two materials. At the beginning, he will not know what this state is, but he will endeavor to find out, and he may succeed in finding out. And when he has found out, he will very likely make remarks of this sort. Quote, "We have discovered that the brittleness of glass is in fact a certain sort of pattern in the molecules of the glass." End quote. That is to say, he will identify brittleness with the state of the glass that is responsible for the liability of the glass to break. For him, a disposition of an object is a state of the object. What makes the state a state of brittleness is the fact that it gives rise to the characteristic manifestations of brittleness. But the disposition itself is distinct from its manifestation. It is the state of the glass that gives rise to these manifestations in suitable circumstances. You will see that this way of looking at dispositions is very different from that of Ryle and the behaviorists. The great difference is this: if we treat dispositions as actual states, as I have suggested that scientists do, even if states whose intrinsic nature may yet have to be discovered, then we can say that dispositions are actual causes, or causal factors at least, which in suitable circumstances actually bring about those happenings which are the manifestations of the disposition. A certain molecular constitution of glass, which constitutes its brittleness, is actually responsible for the fact that when the glass is struck, it breaks. Now, I shall not argue the matter here because the detail of the argument is technical and difficult, but I believe that the view is of dispositions as states, which is the view that is natural to science, is the correct one. I believe it can be shown quite strictly that to the extent that we admit the notion of dispositions at all, we are committed to the view that they are actual states of the object that has the disposition. I may add that I think that the same holds for the closely connected notions of capacities and powers. Here I will simply assume this step in my argument. But perhaps it can be seen that the rejection of the idea that mind is simply a certain range of man's behavior in favor of the view that mind is rather the inner cause of that range of man's behavior is bound up with the rejection of the Rileyan view of dispositions in favor of one that treats dispositions as states of objects and so as having actual causal power. The behaviorists were wrong to identify the mind with behavior. They were not so far off the mark when they tried to deal with cases where mental happenings occur in the absence of behavior by stating that these are dispositions to behave. But in order to reach a correct view, I am suggesting they would have to conceive of these dispositions as actual states of the person who has the disposition, states that have actual power to bring about behavior in suitable circumstances. But to do this is to abandon the central inspiration of behaviorism, that in talking about the mind, we do not have to go behind outward behavior to inner states. And so two separate but interlocking lines of thought have pushed me in the same direction. The first line of thought is that it goes profoundly against the grain to think of the mind as behavior. The mind is rather that which stands behind and brings about our complex behavior. The second line of thought is that the behaviorist dispositions, properly conceived, are really states that underlie behavior, and under suitable circumstances bring about behavior. Putting these two together, we reach the conception of a mental state as a state of the person apt for producing certain ranges of behavior. This formula, a mental state is a state of the person apt for producing certain ranges of behavior, I believe to be a very illuminating way of looking at the concept of a mental state. I have found it very fruitful in the search for detailed logical analysis of the individual mental concepts. Now, I do not think that Hegel's dialectic has much to tell us about the nature of reality, but I think that human thought often moves in a dialectical way from thesis to antithesis and then to the synthesis. Perhaps thought about the mind is a case in point. I have already said that classical philosophy tended to think of the mind as an inner arena of some sort. This we may call the thesis. Behaviorism moved to the opposite extreme. The mind was seen as outward behavior. This is the antithesis. My proposed synthesis is that the mind is properly conceived as an inner principle, but a principle that is identified in terms of the outward behavior it is apt for bringing about. This way of looking at the mind and mental states does not itself entail a materialist or physicalist view of man, for nothing is said in this analysis about the intrinsic nature of these mental states. But it is, we have, as I have asserted, that we do have general scientific grounds for thinking that man is nothing but a physical mechanism. We can go on to argue that the mental states are in fact nothing but physical states of the central nervous system, or the CNS. Along these lines, then, I would look for an account of the mind that is compatible with a purely materialist theory of man. I have tried to carry out this program in detail in a materialist theory of mind. There are, as may be imagined, all sorts of powerful objections that can be made to this view. But in what follows, I propose to do only one thing. I will develop one very important objection to my view of the mind, an objection felt by many philosophers, and then try to show how the objection should be met. The view that our notion of mind is nothing but that of an inner principle apt for bringing about certain sorts of behavior may be thought to share a certain weakness with behaviorism. Modern philosophers have put the point about behaviorism by saying that although behaviorism may be a satisfactory account of the mind from an other person point of view, it will not do as a first person account. To explain, in our encounters with other people, all we ever observe is their behavior, their actions, their speech, and so on. And so, if we simply consider other people, behaviorism might seem to do full justice to the facts. But the trouble about behaviorism is that it seems so unsatisfactory as applied to our own case. In our own case, we seem to be aware of so much more than mere behavior. Suppose that now we conceive of the mind as an inner principle apt for bringing about certain sorts of behavior. This again fits the other person cases very well. Bodily behavior of a very sophisticated sort is observed, quite different from the behavior that ordinary physical objects display. It is inferred that this behavior must spring from a very special sort of inner cause in the object that exhibits this behavior. This inner cause is christened the mind, and those who take a physicalist view of man argue that it is simply the central nervous system of the body observed. Compare this with the case of glass. Certain characteristic behavior is observed, the breaking and shattering of the material when acted upon by relatively small forces. A small inner state of the glass is postulated to explain this behavior. Those who take a purely physicalist view of glass then argue that this state is a natural state of the glass. It is perhaps an arrangement of its molecules and not, say, the peculiarly malevolent disposition of the demons that dwell in glass. But when we turn our own case, the position may seem less plausible. We are conscious. We have experiences. Now we can say that to be conscious, to have experiences, is simply for something to go on within us, apt for the causing of certain sorts of behavior. Is this true? Well, such an account does not seem to do any justice to the phenomena. And so it seems that our account of the mind, like behaviorism, will fail to do justice to the first-person case. In order to understand the objection better, it may be helpful to consider a particular case. If you have driven for a very long distance without a brake, you may have had experience of a certain curious state of automatism, which can occur in these conditions. One can suddenly come to and realize that one has driven for long distances without being aware of what one was doing, or indeed without being aware of anything. One has kept the car on the road, used the brake and the clutch perhaps, yet all without any awareness of what he or she was doing. Now, if we consider this case, it is obvious that in some sense mental processes are still going on when one is in such an automatic state. Unless one's will was still operating in some way, and unless one was still perceiving in some way, the car would not still be on the road, of course, but yet, of course, something mental is lacking. Now, I think, when it is alleged that an account of mind as an inner principle apt for the production of certain sorts of behavior leaves out consciousness or experience, what is alleged to have been left out is just whatever is missing in the automatic driving case. It is conceded that an account of mental processes as states of the person apt for the production of certain sorts of behavior may very possibly be adequate to deal with such cases as that of automatic driving. It may be adequate to deal with most of the mental processes of animals who perhaps spend a good deal of their lives in this state of automatism. But it is contended it cannot deal with the consciousness that we normally enjoy. I will now try to sketch an answer to this important and powerful objection. Let us begin in the apparently unlikely place and consider the way that an account of mental processes of the sort I am giving would deal with sense perception. Now, psychologists in particular have long realized that there is a very close logical tie between sense perception and selective behavior. Suppose we want to decide whether an animal can perceive the difference between red and green. We might give the animal a choice between two pathways, over one of which a red light shines and over the other of which a green light shines. If the animal happens by chance to choose the green pathway, we reward it. If it happens to choose the other pathway, we do not reward it. If after some trials the animal systematically takes the green light pathway, and if we become assured that the only relevant differences in the two pathways are the differences in the color of the lights, we are entitled to say that the animal can see this color difference. Using its eyes, it selects between red lighted and green lighted pathways, so we can say it can see the difference between green and red. Of course, as you know, many animals are colorblind and cannot tell the difference between green and red. Now, a behaviorist would be tempted to say that the animals regularly selecting the green lighted pathway was its perception of the color difference. But this is unsatisfactory because we all want to say that perception is something that goes on within the person or animal, within its mind. Although, of course, this mental event is normally caused by the operation of the environment upon the organism. Suppose, however, that we speak instead of capacities for selective behavior toward the current environment. And suppose we think of these capacities, like dispositions, as actual inner states of the organism. We can then think of the animal's perception as a state within the animal apt, if the animal is so impelled for selective behavior between the red and green lighted pathways, even if the red and green lighted pathways are occurring randomly from right to left. In general, we can think of perceptions as inner states or events apt for the production of certain sorts of selective behavior towards our environment. To perceive is like acquiring a key to a door. You do not have to use the key. You can put it in your pocket and never bother about the door. But if you do want to open the door, the key may be essential. The blind man is a man who does not acquire certain keys, and as a result is not able to operate in his environment in the way that someone who has his sight can operate. It seems then a very promising view to take of perceptions that they are inner states defined by the sorts of selective behavior that they enabled the perceiver to exhibit, if so impelled. Now, how is this the discussion of perception related to the question of consciousness of experience? The sort of thing that the driver who is in a state of automatism has not received, but which we normally do have. Simply this. My proposal is that consciousness, in this sense of the word, is nothing but perception or awareness of the state of our own mind. The driver in a state of automatism perceives or is aware of the road. If he did not, the car would be in a ditch. But he is not currently aware of this awareness of the road. He perceives the road, but he does not perceive his perceiving, or anything else that is going on in his mind. He is not, as we normally are, conscious of what is going on in his mind. And so I conceive of consciousness or experience, in this sense of the words, in the way that Locke and Kant conceived it, as like perception. Kant, in a striking phrase, spoke of inner sense. We cannot directly observe the minds of others, but each of us has the power to observe directly our own minds and perceive what is going on in there, even though we do not know the underlying biological foundations of our minds. The driver, in any case, in the automatic state is one whose inner eye is shut, who is not currently aware of what is going on in his own mind. Now, if this account is along the right lines, why should we not give an account of this inner observation along the same lines as we have already given of perception? Why should we not conceive of it as an inner state, a state in this case directed towards other inner states and not to the environment, which enables us, if we are so impelled, to behave in a selective way towards our own states of mind? One who is aware or conscious of his thoughts or of his or her emotions is one who has the capacity to make discriminations between his or her different mental states. His or her capacity might be exhibited in words. They might be able to say that they were in an angry state of mind when and only when he or her was in an angry state of mind, but such verbal behavior would be the mere expression or result of the awareness. The awareness itself would be an inner state, the sort of inner state that gave the man or woman a capacity for such behavioral expressions. So, I have argued that consciousness of our own mental state may be assimilated to perception of our own mental state, and that, like other perceptions, it may be conceived of as an inner state or event giving a capacity for selective behavior. in this case, selective behavior towards our own mental state. All this is meant to be simply a logical analysis of consciousness, and none of it entails, although it does not rule out, a purely physicalist account of what these inner states are. But if we are convinced on general scientific grounds that a purely physical account of man is likely to be the true one, then there seems to be no bar to our identifying these inner states with purely physical states of the central nervous system, or the CNS for short. And so consciousness of our own mental state becomes simply the scanning of one part of our central nervous system by another. Consciousness is a self-scanning mechanism in the central nervous system. As I have emphasized before, I have done no more than sketch a program for a philosophy of mind. There are all sorts of expansions and elucidations to be made, and all sorts of doubts and difficulties to be stated and overcome. But I hope I have done enough to show that a purely physicalist theory of mind is an exciting and plausible intellectual option.